the Second World War, a global conflict, and, at its heart, a desperate struggle for control of the Atlantic. For Germany, the path to challenging Allied naval power was fraught with insurmountable obstacles. The vast superiority of the British and American surface fleets rendered any attempt to build a traditional surface navy an impossibility. Thus, Germany's principal naval weapon became its U-boat arm. These submarines were the only force capable of seriously threatening the vital sea lanes that sustained the Allied war effort. At the helm of this crucial branch stood Admiral Dönitz. On January 30, 1943, Dönitz consolidated his power as commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy, succeeding Admiral Raeder. This appointment significantly elevated the U-boat command's influence, ensuring a consistent strategic focus on submarine warfare, even as the broader war situation deteriorated. Dönitz, contrary to some historical narratives that portray him as solely interested in submarines, did fiercely advocate for the big ships like the Tirpitz and Scharnhorst against their decommissioning. Yet, his primary strategic goal remained clear: to secure priority for new and better equipment and faster U-boat development. However, the U-boat arm faced profound challenges from within Germany's own war machine. Industrial strains were acute. Steel allocation for the Navy, once 160,000 tons per month in 1939, had plummeted to 121,000 tons by the first quarter of requirements. Despite Dönitz's urgent appeal for an additional 60,000 tons, Hitler approved an increase of only 45,000 tons per month. Labor shortages also took their toll, with U-boat refit times increasing dramatically. The ratio of sea time to dockyard time shifted from 6:4 in late 1941 to a mere 4:6 by late 1942. This meant more boats spending more time in port, less time on patrol. Technologically, critical gaps persisted. By May 1943, new U-boat weapons such as improved anti-aircraft guns, anti-destroyer torpedoes, and advanced radar systems, conceived in the summer of 1942, had still not become available. The acoustic homing torpedo, the Zahnkönig or G7S, intended as a destroyer buster, was slated for October 1943, with its predecessor, the Volk, seeing only limited use since the start of the year. But the most glaring vulnerability was radar. U-boats were initially unable to detect Allied aircraft fitted with this crucial technology. Early German detection devices, like the Metox receiver, proved woefully inadequate, recording observations between 120 and 250 centimeters between March and May 1943, yet Allied aircraft remained undetected. Uncertainty about the nature of Allied radar, particularly centimetric radar, persisted as late as January 1944. The hoped-for Wannsee receiver, which could automatically sweep a wider wave band, and the Naxos crystal detector for centimetric radar, were still in development, expected only by the year's end. Compounding these issues was the critical failure of the Luftwaffe to provide adequate air support and reconnaissance. Reichsmarschall Göring's intransigent attitude towards naval air operations was a constant source of frustration. A meeting between Dönitz and Hitler on February 26, 1943, to discuss air support and subsequent negotiations with Göring yielded only the promise of one Geschwader, or air wing, for Atlantic surveillance, with consideration given to BV-222 flying boats and Ju-290s. Plans for FW-190s, with extra tanks to attack coastal command aircraft, also remained largely aspirational. This lack of integrated air power critically weakened U-boat operations, leaving them exposed. The cumulative weight of these Allied advancements, coupled with Germany's internal struggles and technological deficits, culminated in a catastrophic turning point, the period known as the May Crisis of 1943. This was not, as often mythologized, the result of a single new superweapon. Rather, it was the sheer weight of Allied opposition, improved radar, more numerous and effective anti-submarine aircraft, and refined operational tactics that led to the effective collapse of the U-boat campaign. The losses became unsustainable. Despite this crisis, the U-boat remained Germany's primary naval offensive tool, a strategic necessity that forced the Allies to tie down significant resources. This desperate situation fueled a relentless drive for technological innovation in the late war effort, from new torpedoes to radar countermeasures. The later shift of naval construction responsibility to Armaments Minister Speer further underscored the dire state of Germany's naval industrial capacity and the urgent need for centralized, efficient control in a war already trending towards defeat. The May crisis of 1943, with its catastrophic losses, forced a stark re-evaluation within the U-boat command. On May 24, 1943, operations against North Atlantic convoys were formally suspended. This marked a significant turning point, a strategic withdrawal from the primary battleground. A complex radio deception plan was immediately initiated to mask these U-boat movements, aiming to sustain the illusion of a continued U-boat threat. However, this elaborate ruse proved ineffective against the precision of Allied radar and intelligence. The supposed U-boat scare in the North Atlantic during this period was largely an Allied intelligence construct. The actual numbers of U-boats in the operational area had plummeted, never exceeding 6 in June 1943. The fundamental issue was not simply losses, but a profound tactical stagnation on the German side, contrasted with relentless Allied innovation. Existing U-boat designs were proving utterly inadequate. Their maximum submerged speed of 6 knots for a mere 45 minutes made them painfully slow and vulnerable when confronted by increasingly fast and radar-equipped Allied aircraft. Belated diving was identified as a primary cause of U-boat casualties, a fatal hesitation in the face of overwhelming air attack. Initial attempts to address this were desperate and often belated. By May 1943, many U-boats were still unequipped with the additional anti-aircraft guns that had been designed to counter the air threat. For a time, further sailings from Germany were prohibited until quadruple mountings could be fitted. Early experiences, such as that of U.758, equipped with quadruple 2-centimeter mountings, showed some promise in engaging carrier-borne aircraft. U-boat to submarine designed to fight on the surface against air attacks, but these were stopgap measures, insufficient against the sheer volume and sophistication of Allied air power. The most dangerous operational area became the Bay of Biscay. Here, the shift to group sailing, intended for mutual defense against air attacks, imploded under concentrated Allied air superiority. The waters southwest of the Azores, once a relatively safe haven for refueling, also became a graveyard. Attempts to intercept convoys there proved consistently fruitless, with U-boats such as U.232, U.435, U.95135, and U.1935, code. Admiral Dönitz, confronted with this grim reality, was compelled to shift his strategic priorities. Initially, favoring smaller, more numerous U-boats, the unsustainable losses forced him to accept a radical new design. The concept of the electro-boat, specifically the Type XXSE U-boat, had first been suggested at a Paris conference in November 1942 by constructors Schürer and Bracking. Theoretical calculations began in January 1943, with preliminary designs completed by June. July 8, 1943, Hitler himself approved the building of these revolutionary submarines, and by August 13, the order was given for a full transition to building the Type Tex-20 and the smaller, highly maneuverable Type Tex-3. These new boats were a desperate strategic gamble. The Type 10X, with its streamlined hull and powerful batteries, promised unprecedented submerged performance, up to 18 knots for 1.5 hours, or 12-14 knots for 10 hours. It featured improved echo-ranging gear and advanced hydrophones, and was designed to fire 18 of its 20 torpedoes in under 20 minutes, addressing earlier torpedo issues. But this ambitious program faced immense logistical and production constraints. It required vast allocations of steel and non-ferrous metals, creating difficult trade-offs with other naval priorities. The cancellation of the Type 642 building program in July and August 1943 signaled the abandonment of an entire generation of submarines in favor. The 1943 building program, aiming for 27 operational U-boats per month in the latter half of the year, was already struggling. The personnel requirements alone were staggering. An estimated 335,000 officers and men for the U-boat arm, with only 60,000 available. Even General Cattell, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Command, expressed concerns about the feasibility of such demands. The U-boat campaign had reached a profound impasse. The promise of the Type Tex-1 represented a future that was, for the moment, still beyond reach. Meanwhile, the existing U-boat fleet faced an increasingly lethal threat, its operational effectiveness eroded by superior Allied air power, advanced anti-submarine tactics, and a failure to adapt its own strategies. High losses continued through July and August 1943, even as the future of submarine warfare was being desperately redrawn. While the Atlantic proved increasingly lethal, U-boats initially found some operational success in more distant waters. During the first few days of July, U-boats operating in the Caribbean and off the Brazilian coast claimed the destruction of 10 convoy ships and 7 independents. British records, while lower, confirmed significant losses: 7 ships sunk and 1 damaged in convoy, and 6 sunk and 1 damaged out of convoy. But these successes were heavily dependent on at-sea refueling, a logistical chain that was about to break. Meanwhile, the perilous Bay of Biscay transit had seen a brief deceptive period of success with new group tactics. Early June reports indicated nearly as many boats passing through the bay as in May 1943, with only 3 lost and 2 forced to return. These group procedure tactics intended for mutual defense were initially seen as a partial solution. However, Admiral Dönitz's war diary entry on June 13th already reflected concern. The disadvantage of group tactics against multiple aircraft was becoming starkly evident. The Allied response was swift and overwhelming. Allied aircraft, now often operating in concert, shifted their tactics from direct, immediate attack to shadowing U-boat groups and waiting for reinforcements. Interceptor fighters, such as Mosquitoes and Beaufighters, were increasingly integrated into these attacks, proving devastatingly effective. On June 14th, a group of 5 U-boats suffered severe casualties from a simultaneous assault by 4 heavy fighters. Among them, U.564, damaged by a Sunderland, was forced to return and subsequently sunk. 2 other U-boats, U.68 and U.55 fighter attacks, their crews decimated by similar heavy fighter attacks. The Bay of Biscay became a relentless gauntlet. In the first 3 weeks of July alone, 7 U-boats were lost and 3 severely damaged in this critical transit area. Hopes for new weaponry, such as the Calgaret radio-controlled glider bomb against blockading forces, were delayed. Promising German aircraft, like the Me-410S, described as the only match for the Beaufighters, were withdrawn after a single sortie for home defense, leaving the U-boats without effective air cover. Even the addition of twin 2-centimeter guns proved insufficient against the sustained air patrols. By July 18th, the first critical reports from U-boat commanders at sea decried the group procedure as flawed. Of 17 U-boats that sailed in late July, a catastrophic 10 were lost, and 1 severely damaged by the end of the month. On August 2nd, faced with this untenable situation, the departure of U-boats from Atlantic bases was stopped, and those already at sea were recalled. The implications for operations in remote areas were equally dire. The critical need for at-sea refueling was systematically undermined. Prior to May 1943, U-tankers like U.464 and U.116 had already been lost. Then, in late July, 3 more U-tankers, U.459, U.461, and U.462 were destroyed in the Bay of Biscay. This logistical collapse was exacerbated by the introduction of independent Allied carrier patrols. On July 21st, outgoing and returning U-boats were instructed to avoid the area between the Azores and the Canaries, a key refueling zone due to these new patrols. Between June and July 1943, 8 U-boats were lost south and southwest of the Azores. One such loss, U.118, was directly attributed to carrier-borne aircraft. The desperate struggles of individual U-boats painted a grim picture. On August 1st, U.383 was disabled, triggering frantic rescue attempts by other boats like U.218 and U.706, which themselves came under attack from many surface forces. Perhaps no account better illustrates the sheer terror than that of U.10, commander on August 2nd. Attacked by 2 Sunderlands, he reported sustaining severe damage, losing most of his bridge personnel and guns crew, and ultimately being forced to abandon ship. Even a damaged flak U-boat, U.462, saw its bridge and guns crew decimated by Beaufighters. This was a systematic dismantling of the U-boat's offensive reach. The Onesie radar search receiver, a potential technological counter to Allied radar, was not expected until the end of August, a delay that proved fatal for many. With the Atlantic becoming a death trap, the U-boat command was forced to seek new operational areas. The Group Monsoon 9 Type 1XE U-boats was diverted to the Indian Ocean, a distant and less developed theatre of war. This move, born of necessity, marked a profound shift in German naval strategy, a retreat from the main battleground, ceding effective control of the Atlantic to the Allies. By the summer of 1943, even the distant operating areas once considered safer for U-boats were becoming critically dangerous. Commanders like Kapitänleutnant Emmermann of U.172 assessed the effectiveness of enemy air patrols off the Brazilian coast as extraordinary. The belief that remote areas offered less effective air patrols was a dangerous misconception. Between June 20th and August 20th, 1943, one-third of all U-boats operating in these supposedly less defended areas were lost. The central, devastating blow to U-boat operations was the revelation of a self-inflicted vulnerability, the Metoxer. This device, intended to detect enemy radar, inadvertently emitted its own detectable radiations. Allied aircraft, equipped with long-range radar and systems like ASV, could effectively home in on these Metox emissions from significant distances. This primitive technology had become a fatal beacon. Admiral Dönitz, confronted with this undeniable fact, reported the deplorable and disgraceful matter of the Metox radiations to Hitler on August 19, 1943. By August 14, the use of Metox and similar Grandin receivers was banned outright. This was a critical turning point. The U-boat's primary warning system had become its deadliest betrayer. The logistical chain, already fragile, collapsed under this sustained assault. The loss of three crucial U-tankers, U.459, U.461, and U.462, in the Bay of Biscay in late July 1943 directly triggered the abandonment of major Central Atlantic operations. These tankers were the lifeblood of distant patrols. Without them, U-boats like U.847 could not sustain their missions. U.847 sank after refueling just 6 boats near the Azores. The fate of U.525, which did not appear for refueling and was presumed lost before August 13th, highlighted the precariousness of these rendezvous. U.66, battered by carrier-borne aircraft near the Azores, was forced into multiple rendezvous shifts, losing contact with U.117, which itself was presumed lost on August 13th. On August 18th, U.760 came under heavy attack from 2 enemy destroyers near the Azores. Between July 22nd and August 3rd, 1943, an astonishing 22 U-boats were lost. By August 8th, all but 5 U-boats operating between Dakar and Freetown were heading home, their operations rendered untenable. The Central Atlantic campaign was effectively over. The crisis spurred a desperate scramble for new technology. The Hageneck receiver, also known as Wanzer, was rushed into production. Designed to be non-radiating and capable of detecting intermittent radar emissions, it was hoped to replace the compromised Metox. Simultaneously, the T5 acoustic torpedo, dubbed Zunkönig, was accelerated with 80 torpedoes delivered to Western bases by August 1, 1943. This new weapon, intended to force a breach in enemy escorts, saw its maintenance units established in early August. Yet, even with these frantic efforts, the statistics were grim. Over 2/3 of U-boat losses between June 20th and August 20, 1943, occurred not during convoy attacks, but in transit and waiting areas, a testament to the pervasive and lethal reach of Allied air surveillance and sophisticated detection systems. The psychological impact of these losses and the shock of the Metox failure was profound, requiring significant efforts to restore the fighting spirit of the U-boat crews. Despite the setbacks of May, a new misplaced confidence began to emerge in U-boat command. On September 13, 1943, Admiral Dönitz issued a message stating that the radar situation has changed in your favor. This optimism was largely fueled by the anticipation of new defensive technologies like Wanzer and the offensive potential of the Zunkönig acoustic torpedo. It was believed that Wanzer, coupled with heavier anti-aircraft weapons, had improved U-boat security, especially in the Bay of Biscay. However, this perception was built on fragile foundations. The new T5 torpedo, or Zunkönig, was deployed with high hopes. It was an acoustic torpedo, designed to home in on the noise of escort vessels, and U-boats typically carried 2 forward and 2 aft. Standard G7A and G7E torpedoes were still used for merchant ship attacks. But the Zaunkönig itself came with critical operational challenges. Its initial 400-meter arming range posed a direct threat to the firing U-boat, forcing commanders to execute a dangerous crash dive immediately after a bow shot to avoid self-destruction. This often proved impractical, requiring U-boats to dive to unsafe depths. The first major engagement involving the Zaunkönig was against convoys on 200, 2 and ONS-18 between September 20th and 23rd, 1943. The U-boat claims were extraordinary: 12 destroyers, certainly, and 3 probably sunk by T5 torpedoes, along with 9 merchant ships by ordinary torpedoes. Yet post-war analysis of British records revealed a starkly different and far more sobering reality. Only 3 escort vessels, HMCS Croy, HMS Polyanthus, and HMS Chen, were sunk, and 1, HMS Lagum, was damaged. At least 2 U-boats were lost. This massive discrepancy between claim and reality was a critical strategic miscalculation that would plague the U-boat command, feeding a false sense of effectiveness. This period did see a successful Focke-Wulf attack on August 27th, using remote-controlled glider bombs to sink HMS Egret and severely damage a cruiser, demonstrating a new German air capability, but this was a rare, isolated success. Despite the growing evidence of U-boat vulnerability, Dönitz, influenced by initial battle reports and the vocal opinions of some commanders, including a convoy specialist officer who was unreservedly in favor, sanctioned an even riskier tactic. On October 16th, he issued a direct order: remain surfaced, shoot your way to the convoy with flak. This audacious command, overruling the grave misgivings of his own staff officer operations, sent U-boats directly into the teeth of Allied anti-submarine defenses. The consequences were predictable. Operations against HX-259 and SC-143 in October 1943 yielded U-boat claims of 2 enemy destroyers, certainly, and 1 probably sunk. Actual British records confirmed only the sinking of the Polish destroyer, or Car. 3 U-boats fell victim to air attacks. In a subsequent operation against ONS-20, only 1 ship of 6,625 tons was sunk, while U.964 was sunk, and several other U-boats were severely damaged. The U-boat U.338 was believed to have been sunk shortly after issuing a signal to remain surfaced and repel aircraft, a grim testament to the new tactic's danger. Adding to the German woes is the increasing dominance of Allied intelligence. While German radio intelligence relied on cracking British ciphers like Frankfurt and München, the Allies continuously superseded these codes. By late 1943 and early 1944, the new ciphers München and Gallion were proving increasingly unreliable and delayed. Even German attempts to detect Allied diversionary tactics using the Grenzwellenempfänger, a device providing bearings on convoy R/T traffic, were often disregarded in favor of less reliable visual or hydrophone data. The lack of effective long-range reconnaissance aircraft, like the Ju-290, was critically lamented by German intelligence, rendering decisive operations almost impossible. Ultimately, the U-boat command's reliance on exaggerated claims and flawed tactical assumptions proved disastrous. Dönitz himself, by 1944, began to regard U-boat claims with reserve, acknowledging the discrepancies. The perceived effectiveness of the Zaunkönig torpedo and improved A defenses had not shifted the balance of power. Instead, it led to costly, ineffective operations, draining German resources and bleeding their U-boat arm, while Allied countermeasures and superior intelligence continued to assert their dominance. Despite the mounting evidence of an increasingly hostile Atlantic, U-boat command persisted in its belief that new tactics and technologies could still turn the tide. The fight-it-out-on-the-surface tactic, sanctioned by Dönitz, continued to be employed. Yet the devastating engagement against convoy ONS-20 in October 1943 demonstrated its fatal flaw. For the sinking of just 1 merchant ship, 3 and perhaps more U-boats were lost. 6 boats of Group Schlieffen alone were destroyed during this operation. The new 2-centimeter AA guns, while initially proving satisfactory and causing enemy aircraft to exercise caution, were fundamentally insufficient. The 2-centimeter shell was often ineffective against heavily armored bombers, and simultaneous attacks by multiple aircraft easily overwhelmed the armament. A new 3.7-centimeter automatic AA gun, under development since 1942, began fitting in November 1943, once again raising hopes for U-boats to fight it out on the surface. But this was a response to a tactical problem already past its peak. The logistical lifeline for distant operations was by now all but severed. From a force of 12 U-tankers in May 1943, their numbers had dwindled to just 3 by August. The refueling area north of the Azores became a death trap. 2 tankers, U.460 and U.222, along with 5 operational boats, were sunk there. This forced the complete abandonment of this crucial strategic zone, severely limiting the U-boats' operational range and forcing them to conserve precious fuel. A passage to 25 degrees west now required 15 days submerged, and to 40 degrees west, 19 days, with Atlantic winter conditions allowing only 90 to 100 miles per day. Critically, the U-boats remained blind to the most dangerous Allied threat. The 1Z receiver, hoped to be the answer, failed to detect enemy radar. Worse, Dönitz, suspecting it was radiating, banned its use along with the shortwave/T receiver on November 5, 1943. This left U-boats with no effective warning equipment against enemy radar. The consistent surprise attacks could only be explained by a new technological leap by the Allies. Though primitive Borkum crystal detectors were later introduced, they offered little solace. The impact was immediate and devastating. Admiral Dönitz's instructions to commanders on November 7, 1943, to prioritize taking prisoners, reflected a shift from aggressive engagement to the cold calculus of survival and intelligence. By November 11th, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy decided that flak boats should be reconverted, a tacit admission that their anti-aircraft armament, even when improved, was insufficient against overwhelming air power. U-boat dispositions, such as Group Siegfried, formed east of Newfoundland on October 24, or Group Schill, pursuing convoys MKS-30 and SL-139 in mid-November, repeatedly failed to intercept targets. Despite air reconnaissance sightings by FW-200S, which themselves suffered from engine trouble and radar defects, the U-boats could not close the distance. On November 23, the pursuit of MKS-30 was abandoned. The last operational boats were refueled for their return to base on November 8, 1943. Between October 27 and November 10, 2 small-scale convoy operations west of Spain yielded little. 262's submerged attack on November 31 was a rare success in a period dominated by failure. The U-boat campaign had lost its initiative. It was largely reactive, driven by Allied movements and a desperate search for viable targets. The Western Atlantic was effectively abandoned. Operations were confined to areas where some air support might be possible, a severe limitation on their reach. The introduction of the first radar-equipped Ju-290 heavy bomber aircraft in mid-November, capable of day and night reconnaissance, and directing U-boats, offered a glimmer of hope, but it was a hope that came too late to reverse the terminal decline of 1943. By late 1943 and early 1944, the German U-boat campaign had reached a critical juncture. Its ability to disrupt Allied convoys was almost entirely dependent on effective air reconnaissance from the Luftwaffe, a support system that proved persistently and fatally inadequate. U-boat groups, such as Schill, Weddigen, and Coronel, were deployed in ambitious patrol lines, but they were operating blind. The failure of coordinated air reconnaissance was systemic. Between November 15 and December 18, 1943, a mere 68 reconnaissance flights were made, an average of just 2 a day. In stark contrast, RAF Coastal Command often flew more sorties in a single day. This utter lack of air support rendered pack tactics obsolete. The complete failure of Group Schill's operations, for example, resulted in the loss of 1 U-boat per subgroup, for the torpedoing of only 1 ship, HMS Chanticleer, and the destruction of 2 enemy aircraft. He-177 attack aircraft, despite an early claim of sinking 2 large ships and damaging 3 others, were quickly transferred due to their limited range and 2 aircraft losses. German reconnaissance aircraft, including the Ju-290S, FW-222S, and Ju-88S, were consistently hampered by technical defects in their radar, radio, and engines. This meant convoys were rarely located with the precision and regularity required for successful U-boat maneuvers. Often U-boats found themselves unable to maintain contact with fast-moving convoys, which deftly circumvented their dispositions to the north and south. Allied diversionary starshell fire further misled U-boats reliant on visual sighting at night. Even the Grenzwellen Empfänger, designed to detect such tactics, was often not effectively utilized. Misleading intelligence sometimes led U-boats to target Spanish trawlers instead of actual convoys. Adding to these woes, the Type 6 IC U-boat, once the workhorse, was becoming top-heavy due to increased anti-aircraft armament, leading to severe rolling of up to 60 degrees and reduced visibility. The much-anticipated T5 torpedo also failed to meet expectations. The cumulative effect was devastating. U-boats were frequently forced to submerge for long periods due to relentless air attacks and the strength of Allied escorts. They simply could not maneuver ahead of convoys in time. By January 1944, the formal abandonment of large-scale patrol line and scouting formations for convoy interception was a tacit admission of defeat. The U-boat arm conceded that pack attacks were no longer viable without consistent air direction. Allied hunter-killer groups and intensified anti-submarine activity southwest of Ireland proved highly effective. One such engagement saw German claims of sinking 4 destroyers, but British records confirmed only the loss of HMS Hurricane. By February 1944, the near-total withdrawal of U-boat operations west of the British Isles underscored the overwhelming effectiveness of Allied defences. Admiral Dönitz repeatedly stressed the critical need for adequate air reconnaissance, even directly addressing Goring on its importance. But the systemic deficiencies persisted. Operations like ONS-29 in February 1944 saw a mere 10 operational aircraft out of 15 available, again due to defects. The cost was catastrophic. Group High 1 lost 3 of its 19 boats, and Group High 2 lost 4 of its 7 boats during this single operation. These failures marked a significant defeat for the German U-boat arm, diminishing its ability to effectively disrupt Allied supply lines. It cemented a strategic shift towards a more defensive posture and a desperate, futile hope for future, advanced U-boat types to reverse the tide. The German U-boat campaign was ultimately undone not just by Allied ingenuity, but by a fundamental lack of understanding of maritime warfare at the highest levels of German command. The Supreme Command and Air Staff's disregard for the U-boat campaign's significance manifested most critically in their failure to develop a strong naval air arm. This omission left U-boats vulnerable and severely limited their operational scope. Early reconnaissance missions in February 1943 already revealed a stark truth. Allied carrier-borne fighters could operate at night. Their fighter direction organization was amazing, and a single Ju-290 was utterly insufficient for shadowing a carrier-escorted convoy. Even German aircraft radar could be jammed by enemy ships. A cycle of technological disadvantage began to systematically dismantle the U-boat's offensive capabilities. The primitive Metox receiver, now understood as a primary cause of heavy losses due to its radiating emissions, was replaced by the Hegenuk radar search receiver. This new device offered temporary relief. Yet, its promise was short-lived. The Allies soon introduced centimetric radar, which the Hegenuk could not register, once again rendering German detection equipment obsolete. Naxos equipment later revealed that the enemy's Rotterdam set used the 8 to 12 centimeter waveband, confirming the profound technological gap. Allied anti-submarine warfare was constantly evolving, deploying increasingly sophisticated methods. Noise boxes, both decoy and rattle buoys, were designed to confuse U-boats. New, mysterious sound detection, dubbed musical saw equipment, emerged. Depth charges became more lethal. Killer depth charges of 450 kilograms and an extra heavy type between 250 and 340 kilograms were devastating. The Hedgehog, a gyro-stabilized rocket battery, could fire 24 small depth charges with terrifying precision. The logistical collapse, triggered by the loss of U-tankers like U.460 and U.22A in October 1943, forced the cessation of refueling facilities in remote areas. This directly curtailed long-range operations. The impact on experienced U-cruiser commanders was devastating. On their very first outward-bound operations, these seasoned crews were meeting an increasingly lethal fate. U.20 in June 1943, U.99 in July, U.847 in August, followed by U.847 in November, U.850 in December, and U.177 in February 1944. Even the U-tanker Charlotte Schliemann was sunk in February 1944, while U.1059 was destroyed by aircraft from USS Block Island in March 1944. Rendezvous points, such as the one that saw U.544, presumed sunk by carrier-borne aircraft on January 16, 1944, were continuously compromised, possibly due to intelligence failures or decryption. Despite the temporary success of Haginik in remote areas, leading to sinkings like USA. 161 off the Brazilian coast in September 1943, and U.533 in the Gulf of Aden in October, these were isolated victories. Even the Brupe Monsun boats making their perilous journey to the Indian Ocean base at Penang faced immense challenges. By March 1944, faced with unsustainable losses and overwhelming Allied superiority, the U-boat command was forced to adopt a defensive posture. Operations shifted from costly convoy attacks to single-boat missions, focused primarily on tying down enemy forces. The effectiveness of Allied naval forces was clear. The percentage of U-boat losses attributed to them increased significantly in late 1943 and early 1944. The U-boat arm was in terminal decline. Its dwindling numbers made sustained offensive operations impossible. The strategic omission of a strong naval air arm at the war's outset, combined with the relentless pace of Allied technological advancement, had created an insurmountable challenge. The picture of enemy anti-submarine measures, finally formed by the spring of 1944, was one of pervasive, technologically superior, and utterly lethal opposition. The desperate struggle in the North Atlantic was defined by a relentless technological arms race, one that Germany was rapidly losing. A crucial turning point occurred around March 1943, with the introduction of Allied centimeter-wave radar. This advanced technology, first seen in aircraft like Liberators, fitted with both ASV and Rotterdam sets, provided vastly superior range and definition. Its emergence correlated with a steep and alarming rise in U-boat losses. The German Naval High Command and Admiral Dönitz himself were gravely concerned. On January 13, 1944, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy personally informed Hitler of the profound threat posed by British centimeter-wave radar. German radar research and development had been critically mismanaged initially under Reichsmarschall Göring. This neglect led to a misallocation of scientific talent and a continuous lag behind Allied advancements. Dönitz recognized this critical flaw and stressed the urgent need for a reorganization of radar research under specialist control. Luschen, director of the Central Board of Electrical Engineering, was eventually granted powers to transfer radar research, a belated but crucial step. German radar search receivers, such as Naxos and the later Flage, which boasted a more sensitive cavity aerial and a range of 40-60 kilometers, gradually replaced earlier, less effective systems. But even these did not cover all enemy radar frequencies, leading to missed detections. As Allied 3-centimeter Meadow sets were found in aircraft shot down over Germany, in early 1944, the Germans responded with a Mucker receiver, and later the Tunis, a combination of Flage and Mucker, for active radar Gamma 80-centimeter, were developed. Hohentuel, installed in U-TOS 743, and U-TOS 311 allowed detection of aircraft at distances of 10,000 to 12,000 meters, making gun ranging possible before visual sighting. But these were often too little, too late. The Schnorkel device, developed by Professor Walter, represented a potential lifeline. It was designed to allow U-boats to operate continuously submerged, recharging batteries and refreshing air below the surface. However, its initial designs were impractical, and production was plagued by difficulties, including damage en route and the perils of foul air if the Schnorkel head became submerged. While commanders like that of U.667 enthusiastically reported on its use after a 9-day submerged voyage in May 1944, the grim reality was often different. U.264, lost on February 1944, was unable to report its snorkel experience. .575 also disappeared after reporting on its use. These losses highlighted the device's inherent vulnerabilities. Beyond technology, the sheer attrition of the campaign was unsustainable. From the summer of 1943, on average, only 70% of Atlantic boats returned from operations. Since December 1943, an average of some 20% of boats at sea were lost each month. The Bay of Biscay transit, once taking 3 to 5 days, now required 10 to 12 days in 1944. Coastal Command sorties mounted to 40-50 a day in March and April 1944, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. From January to mid-May 1944, only about 30 U-boats reached the Atlantic from German ports. By May, an average of only 4 to 6 U-boats were operating in the western approaches to Britain. In March 1944, faced with these overwhelming odds, the U-boat command made a critical strategic decision to abandon direct attacks on Atlantic convoys. Instead, they adopted a containment strategy, increasing the strength of Group MITI and introducing new radar and search equipment. This was a desperate effort to merely tie down Allied resources, rather than achieving decisive victory. Incidents like U.413, S encounter south of Ireland in February 1944, where a T-5 torpedo was fired and R/T intercepts confirmed a destroyer sinking, or the sinking of HMS Warwick off Cornwall by a U-boat, were isolated tactical successes in a sea of strategic defeat. Allied deception using devices like Thetis buoys in the Bay of Biscay further complicated U-boat operations, ensuring they were always on their guard against surprise air attack. The U-boat campaign was now a war of attrition and survival, its offensive power decisively broken. By 1944, Germany's war economy faced critical shortages of raw materials. The organized, large-scale surface blockade running had ceased by January 1944, following heavy losses in the autumn of 1943. The desperate burden of imports now fell to U-boats. Initially, ambitious plans for Type Tex transport U-boats were laid out in Admiral Dönitz's expanded fleet construction program of April 1943. These specialized submarines were designed to carry significant cargo: 450 tons of rubber, 190 tons of tin, 110 tons of ore. However, faced with construction delays, Dönitz cancelled the entire Type Tex program in May 1944. A redesign of the Type Tex I, the Type Tex IE, was considered for cargo carrying, but this too was a distant prospect. The logistical chain for U-boat operations had irrevocably broken down. The last available U-tanker, U.450, was lost at the end of May. The destruction of U.488 near the Cape Verde Islands in April 1944 and the sinking of the tanker break southeast of Mauritius in May left U-boats like U.168 and the UIT-24 without vital refueling. Commander of U.66, operating in the Central Atlantic, signaled on May 5, 1944. Central Atlantic worse than Bay of Biscay. This collapse meant that while over 80% of U-boat successes between February and June 1944 were achieved in distant areas, 13 ships in the Central and Western Atlantic and 11 in the Indian Ocean, 8 of which were torpedoed by U.510-. These operations were logistically unsustainable. Even experimental solutions like underwater fueling or towing underwater barges, which U.116-3 successfully demonstrated with a 90-ton barge in October 1943, proved impractical for sustained operations. Attempts to use captured Italian submarines, the Mercator boats, were quickly abandoned due to their unfamiliar layout and faulty machinery. With traditional offensive operations crippled, the strategic justification for the U-boat campaign shifted. As assessed by flag officer U-boats, the heavy responsibility was now tying down considerable sea and air escort forces, even if the chances of attack were slim and the risk of not returning was high. Allied Coastal Command patrols intensified dramatically, increasing from an average of 10 to 25, 30 machines a day in the latter half of May 1944. This led to devastating surprise attacks, such as mosquitoes and bombers on U.976 entering St. Nazaire in March, or a similar attack on U.255 in April. These forced U-boats to adopt increasingly perilous operating methods, relying on technologies like the Schnorkel and the Hohentuel radar, which 5 U-boats were ordered to fit by June 1, 1944. The cost of this tying down strategy was immense and unsustainable. By May 13, 1944, the sea time for Type 6 IC U-boats was limited to a mere 8 weeks, reflecting the rapid deterioration of their operational viability. The failure to import vital raw materials via U-boats, as evidenced by the cancellation of the Type X program, meant their contribution had no appreciable difference to Germany's prosecution of the war. The capture of U.505 in June 1944. Despite these crippling losses, the German Navy continued to invest in the Type Tex X-Wide and XIN-202. These advanced designs, with their very great endurance, high submerged speed, and deep diving capability, represented a desperate gamble on future technological superiority. But for 1944, the U-boat war was a strategic stalemate, a costly sacrifice to merely delay the inevitable. By 1944, Germany's war effort faced critical shortages of raw materials. A review in January projected an immediate need for 12 tons of goods like bismuth, selenium, and quinine monthly, and long-term needs, stretching to 1947 for hundreds of tons of rubber, wolfram, molybdenum, and zinc. The ambitious plan to use U-boats for long-distance cargo transport was born of desperation. However, the cancellation of dedicated transport U-boat building in May 1944 forced a reliance on less suitable operational U-boats, stretching already dwindling resources. The contribution of U-boats to these vital imports proved exceptionally limited. Out of a planned 14 U-boats, only 3, the Japanese submarine Kiefer U.178, and U.188-, reached Bordeaux from East Asia in 1944. The risks were immense. Data 843, carrying 100 tons of zinc, reached Norway in April 1945, only to be sunk by an air attack. Nazaire in April 1945 due to insufficient fuel, while U.532 eventually delivered 100 tons of tin, 60 tons of rubber, and other materials to Loch Erebol upon capitulation. These isolated efforts had no appreciable difference to Germany's prosecution of the war. The initial failure of Italian Mercator boats further underscored the theoretical nature of the long-term import plan. Then, on June 6, 1944, at 3:05, the first information of the Normandy landings reached U-boat headquarters. The surprise and scale of the Allied invasion demanded an immediate, albeit ill-conceived, deployment of all available U-boats. Admiral Dönitz, against his better judgment, was compelled to send non-schnorkel boats into the heavily contested danger zone. It was a disastrous operational phase. The overwhelming Allied air superiority and anti-submarine warfare capabilities were vividly captured in the log entry of U.415 on June 7. Attacked by a Sunderland and Liberator, the U-boat sustained damage, including ruptured oil tanks, and struggled desperately to stay afloat. The cost was catastrophic. U.970 and U.955 were sunk on the very first night of the invasion. U.629 and U.373 were lost on the night of June 7. Were lost on the night of June 74D, and U.821 were assumed destroyed on their outward passage around June 9. Within days, 2 of the 9 non-schnorkel boats from Brest were sunk. The schnorkel device, intended to restore U-boat stealth, proved to have a fatal flaw. It was detectable by airborne radar. Production delays, damage due to disrupted traffic, and the difficulty of recharging batteries in congested operational areas further hampered its effectiveness. The log entry of U.984 on June 8, 1944, describes a harrowing 24-hour depth charge pursuit and the desperate struggle to snorkel for air in critical conditions. Lack of operational experience with the schnorkel in shallow, heavily patrolled waters only compounded these challenges. U-boats using Saint boats using St. Evriers, Peter Port in Guernsey for battery charging, such as U.953, U.269, and U.27S, became predictable targets for air attacks. While some successes were achieved, like U.621 sinking LCP-280 with a T-5 torpedo on June 15, torpedo failures were also reported. U.764 sank the frigate Blackwood on the same day. However, the perceived advantage of the schnorkel was effectively neutralized by Allied detection. German Hohentwiel radar, adapted from aircraft radar, functioned quite adequately but could not overcome the pervasive Allied detection. The deployment against the Normandy invasion was a Pyrrhic defense. It failed to significantly impact the success of the Allied landings, but at an immense cost in U-boat losses and crew lives. This period underscored a profound disconnect between German strategic intentions and the practical realities of late-war naval warfare, a testament to the overwhelming and technologically superior Allied anti-submarine capabilities. The summer of 1944, following the Normandy landings, saw German U-boat operations in the English Channel and surrounding waters reach a final desperate phase. Despite immense losses and overwhelming Allied opposition, the campaign persisted, driven by the critical importance of the schnorkel technology and a strategic imperative to tie down Allied resources. The schnorkel was, by all accounts, decisive. Flag officer U-boats assessed that operations close to the British coast would have been out of the question without it, enabling continuously submerged U-boat warfare. The log of U.480 operating north of Seine Bay in August illustrates the harrowing reality. Lying on the bottom is Labout, Interlist, using currents to maneuver and timing attacks around convoy movements. This boat, equipped with Alberic, a rubber coating for protection against ASW location, sank the Setz Enoggety on August 22. After sinking the Sessorminster on August 25, U.480 was hunted for 7 hours, but Alberic provided crucial protection. German claims in this period 20 ships totaling 112,800 tons and 5 escort vessels sunk were, as before, inflated. British records show 5 escort vessels, 4 landing craft of 8,404 tons, and 12 ships of 56,845 tons sunk. While the blow at the enemy's supplies was indecisive, these operations inflicted severe damage and tied down considerable sea and air escort forces, offering some relief to German troops ashore. However, the cost was astronomical. Between June 6 and August 31, 1944, 30 schnorkel boats made 45 sorties in the Channel and off Cornwall. 20 were destroyed, a loss rate of 45% per sortie, and 66% of boats employed. This underscored the obsolescence of older U-boat types. The Seine area, with its intense Allied activity and constant ASW detection, became untenable. Newer schnorkel boats, approaching readiness in western France, were allocated to areas of weaker opposition, such as the Bristol and North Channels. The strategic shift was profound. Between August 24 and 26, 7 U-boats were ordered to return to Norway from the Channel. 8 U-boats left the Biscay bases for Norway from mid-August, their French Atlantic havens now lost. Even the 14 U-boats from Group Mitte in Norwegian ports were transferred to Libau and Revel for operations against Russian naval forces. By the end of August 1944, the last U-boat departed Bordeaux, and U.267 sailed from St. Tode to 16 sailed from St. Tode. Nazaire on September 23, marking the functional end of major U-boat operations from these crucial French Atlantic bases. Despite these immense losses, the U-boat command remained fixated on future technological advantage. Admiral Dönitz viewed the original Type Tex-1 building program as inadequate and pushed for accelerated production. Speer, chairman of the Central Shipbuilding Committee, Herr Merker, and eminent constructor Schure, who saw no fundamental objection to mass production principles, all played roles in this desperate drive. By December 8, 1943, constructional drawings for the new boats were completed, and a new naval building program was submitted on January 1, 1944. Speer promised the first Type XX-1 would be completed by April 1944, with serial delivery accelerating to 30 boats a month by autumn 1945. Contracts were placed for 360 Type XX-1 and 118 Type XI-5. These new types, with their very great endurance, high submerged speed, and deep diving capability, offered the only remaining hope for regaining an offensive edge. Even as U.860 was lost in the South Atlantic in June 1944, and U.198 north of Madagascar in August, the focus was firmly on a future that for the current generation of U-boats would never arrive. Despite the immense production challenges and early-stage design flaws that plagued their development, the German U-boat program, particularly for the revolutionary Type 22, achieved significant technological advancements through improved industrial management and innovative design. Germany managed to maintain a formidable production rate for these advanced submarines in the war's final stages. However, these late war efforts, impressive as they were from a technical and industrial perspective, ultimately came too late. They could not alter the strategic outcome of the war, nor reverse the tide of Allied naval dominance. The legacy of the U-boat war remains a testament to both human ingenuity and the grim realities of industrial warfare. The legacy of the U-boat war remains a testament to both human ingenuity and the grim realities of industrial warfare. Indeed, the journey from drawing board to open sea was fraught with challenges, reflecting the strain on a nation at war. Initial U-boat construction, for instance, was hampered significantly by subcontractor delays and poorly manufactured sections, often exceeding crucial tolerances. A rigid adherence to completion dates by the Central Shipbuilding Committee only exacerbated these issues, leading to the first 7 boats being rushed, uncompleted, and ultimately relegated to training and experimental purposes only. This early period was characterized by considerable antagonism between the Central Shipbuilding Committee, Naval Command, and the various dockyard authorities, a tension that persisted until the summer of 1944. However, German industrial ingenuity responded to these systemic flaws with a crucial turning point: the decision to transfer U-boat shipbuilding responsibility from the Naval Command to the Armaments Minister in May 1943. This strategic shift mobilized the entire German armaments industry and provided alternative production capacity essential after repeated Allied bombing. The result was nothing short of remarkable, enabling unprecedented production figures even under severe wartime strain. Despite bomb damage to industrial centers and dockyards, coupled with traffic disruption and worker displacement, especially from Hamburg, the program achieved extraordinary output. In 1944, 234 U-boats were completed, totaling 220,000 tons. December 1944 alone saw the highest ever monthly production, with 31 U-boats delivered, including 22 of the advanced type Tex Porn, totaling 38,100 tons. This achievement was staggering, nearly matching the 238 U-boats produced in 1942, when German industry was largely unaffected by bombing. The overall completion time for new boats was cut by an impressive 8 to 12 months, a testament to mass production under duress. This remarkable industrial effort also saw the development and implementation of new U-boat types, specifically the Type Tex 20 and X-10-2, representing a significant leap in U-boat technology. These advanced designs were equipped with game-changing features like snorkels, allowing prolonged submerged cruising, and improved torpedo systems for programmed firing in convoy attacks. New echo-ranging gear and plotting tables enhanced their offensive capabilities. The Type X-1, launched in April 1944 and commissioned by June 1944, was designed for a submerged speed of 18 knots for 1 hour 40 minutes, though trials demonstrated an actual 16.5 to 17 knots for 16 to 80 minutes. Its cruising motor speed was a silent 5 to 5.5 knots with a submerged cruising range of over 300 miles at 5 knots. The snorkel head itself was fitted with a Tunis aerial and coated with Sorbo rubber for crucial radar protection, requiring only 3 hours daily to charge batteries. Advanced loop torpedoes, capable of homing onto propeller noises, were virtually immune to Allied Fokker countermeasures. These boats were designed for endurance, capable of reaching Cape Town and back without refueling. The experimental Walter U-boats, such as Type 516, U.7 to 923, even achieved an astonishing 22 knots, while U.792 pushed this record to an unprecedented 25 knots submerged. This continuous, albeit late, innovation directly debunks the myth that the U-boat program was a static entity incapable of technological advancement. It was in fact a relentless pursuit of superiority. However, external pressures mounted relentlessly. The impact of Allied bombing continually retarded carefully timed schedules, necessitating constant adaptation and rerouting of supply chains. Crucially, the forced withdrawal from Biscay bases in late 1944 drastically lengthened operational transit times, increasing the burden on Norwegian and German repair yards. Yards in Bergen and Trondheim, for instance, could handle only about a third of the Atlantic boats, leading to U-boats being inactive for more than twice the time previously required for refitting. Passage from Kristiansand to Kiel often took 6 to 8 days due to mines and escort losses. This loss of vital bases and the effectiveness of Allied air power forced a significant shift in operational focus towards Norwegian bases and increased operations in the Channel and Irish Sea. Air attacks were devastating. On October 4, 1944, U.228 and U.993 were destroyed at Bergen, while U.92 and U.437 were severely damaged. Another raid on October 29 reduced Bergen's yaws. U.735 was sunk at Horten by 200 aircraft on December 28, 1944. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, a surprising resurgence in effectiveness emerged in late 1944 and early 1945. This period challenged the simplistic notion that the U-boat threat was definitively neutralized after the D-Day landings. Admiral Dönitz himself held the firm conviction in the spring of 1944 that old-type U-boats could no longer be used offensively. However, the widespread adoption of an improved type of schnorkel from October 1944 onwards, coupled with specialized training, significantly enhanced U-boat survivability and operational duration. A strategic shift towards operating in shallow coastal waters provided a new form of protection against Allied anti-submarine warfare tactics. The Allied focus on the European mainland, particularly the Russian advance, allowed for a temporary redeployment and concentration of U-boat efforts against British coastal waters. The statistics presented a paradox. U-boat losses unexpectedly decreased while sinkings per boat per day remain suppressedly decreased while sinkings per boat per day remain suppressedly decreased. Between October 1944 and January 1945, only 18 boats were lost, representing something over 10% of the boats at sea, a surprisingly low figure given the intensity of the Allied ASW efforts. Off the North American coast by the end of December 1944, 2 ships, totaling 12,677 tons, had been sunk. U.862 notably sank an American Liberty ship south of Sydney on December 24, 1944, and another ship 700 miles west of Perth on February 6, 1945. In the Channel, U.978 sank 3 ships over 3 weeks. By January 6, 1945, U.486 claimed to have sunk 1 steamship, 3 escort vessels, 1 corvette, and damaged a liner. U.772 achieved further success, sinking 4 ships totaling 21,053 tons and damaging 1 more of 7,076 tons. Even in the Irish Sea, 6 ships, 27,820 tons, were sunk and 1 damaged, 2,198 tons, accompanied by the loss of only 3 U-boats. These operations demonstrate the U-boat's enduring potential as a strategic weapon, even against overwhelming enemy superiority. It continued to disrupt vital Allied supply lines and divert crucial ASW resources. The primitive Metox receiver, an older detection system, was gradually superseded, and the potential of supersonic echo ranging gear on Type Tex-1 boats promised even greater stealth. U-boat .123 of 1944. However, this surprising tactical resurgence was ultimately overwhelmed by the relentless scale of Allied naval power and technological advancements. The text from German naval documents confirms a complex, bureaucratic, and technologically driven U-boat warfare effort. By mid-February 1945, a significant shift occurred as Allied ASW forces began to concentrate intensely in British coastal waters. This led to increasingly dangerous conditions and devastating U-boat losses. Between January and April 1945, the losses escalated dramatically. 7 boats lost in January, 13 in February, 16 in March, and a staggering 29 in April, representing 54% of boats at sea for that month alone. This marked the near collapse of the U-boat arm, forcing a strategic withdrawal from the English and North Channels by the end of March. Despite the promise of Type Tex-22, their introduction came too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the strategic course. Crew training, initially 3 months, was extended to nearly 6 due to defects and necessary repairs. Admiral Dönitz, now appointed Hitler's successor, found himself wrestling with the bitter and thankless task of orchestrating the final surrender and the desperate evacuation of refugees, with each to ever breaking enemy communications for each to ever between January 21 and May 8, 1945. Over 1 million soldiers and refugees were brought back from East Prussian ports, with a total of 2,022,000 from East Prussia and Pomerania. U-boats like U.773 and U.722 were even diverted for extraneous tasks, carrying supplies to St. Nazaire and returning with non-ferrous metals. The final act came in May 1945. Following Hitler's death, Dönitz issued the order for all U-boats at sea to cease hostilities and return to base. General Admiral von Friedeberg negotiated the surrender. The general surrender came into force at 0001 on May 9, 1945. Of the 1153 U-boats of all types built and commissioned during the war, 636 were destroyed by enemy action, and 154 were ultimately surrendered. German claims of sinking over 3,500 ships, totaling 18.3 million tons, were contrasted by Allied records of 2,603 ships, aggregating 13.5 million tons. The U-boat arm, despite its valiant efforts and technological leaps, was ultimately overwhelmed. Its legacy endures as a powerful reminder of desperate ingenuity and the tragic futility of fighting to the bitter end.